The first thing you need to know is this. The story only works if you listen the way it's meant to be listened to. Late at night, lights low, phone face down. And when the moment comes, when the voice tells you to close your eyes, you should decide carefully whether you will obey. Because some stories are just stories. And some stories remember you. It always begins the same way, with a small, harmless thought. The kind you brush away without noticing. A yawn before sleep. A drifting mind. A whisper of tiredness pulling your eyelids down. That's how it started for me, too. I didn't hear screams. I didn't see shadows crawling on the walls. I just felt that familiar heaviness behind my eyes, the gentle pressure that says the day is over and it's time to rest. If only I had fought it a little longer. My name doesn't matter as much as you think. Names feel important, but they don't protect you. What matters is that I'm like you. I work, I get tired, I lie in bed scrolling through videos when I should be sleeping. I like bedtime stories, especially the creepy ones. Horror stories whispered slowly, the kind that make your room feel a little colder. I used to think fear was safe when it came through a screen. I used to think I was in control. That night, I found the video by accident. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The title was simple. Close your eyes. No thumbnail jump scare. No dramatic warning. Just plain text on a dark background. It felt calm. Almost inviting. The description said it was a chilling bedtime horror story, meant to be listened to with eyes closed. I smiled at that. It felt cliché, like something I'd heard 100 times before. I didn't know then that the story wasn't asking. It was preparing me. The voice was soft when it began. Not creepy. Not distorted. Just human. Warm even. The kind of voice that makes you feel safe enough to let your guard down. It talked about rest, about the weight of the day leaving your body, about how closing your eyes doesn't mean giving up control. It means trusting yourself, trusting the quiet, trusting the dark. I remember thinking how well written it was. Simple words, natural pauses, nothing that felt forced or fake. It sounded like someone who understood what it felt like to be tired in a world that never really sleeps. Someone who knew the comfort of lying still and letting your thoughts slow down. Close your eyes, the voice said gently. I didn't. Not at first. Instead, I listened. I watched the progress bar inch forward. I noticed how my breathing matched the rhythm of the narration. In and out. Slow and steady. The room felt different, though I couldn't explain why. Not colder. Just quieter. As if the air itself was listening. The story shifted then. It stopped talking about rest and started talking about memories. About how the mind doesn't shut off when your eyes close. How it opens instead. It spoke about childhood nights, lying in bed, staring into the dark, imagining shapes in the shadows. It reminded me of the way fear used to feel back then, soft, curious, not yet sharp enough to hurt. I swallowed and adjusted my pillow. I told myself this was just a well-made horror story. Psychological. Atmospheric. Nothing more. Close your eyes, the voice repeated. This time I did. Just for a second. The darkness behind my eyelids felt deeper than usual. Not black, but layered. Like standing at the edge of a room with the lights off, knowing there's more space ahead of you than you can see. The voice continued, slower now, as if it knew exactly when my eyes had shut. It described a person lying in bed. Described the weight of the blanket. The sound of the room at night. The faint hum of electricity. My chest tightened when I realized how closely it matched my own room. My own position. Even the small detail of my phone resting near my hand. I opened my eyes again. Nothing had changed. Same ceiling. Same shadows. Same soft glow from the screen. I let out a quiet laugh, feeling silly for getting caught up in it. This was the point of these stories, after all. To blur the line just enough to make your heart beat faster. The voice didn't react to my hesitation. It didn't rush me. It didn't scold me. It just kept going, telling the story of someone who couldn't sleep because they felt watched whenever they closed their eyes. Someone who noticed that the darkness behind their eyelids didn't stay still. Sometimes, the voice said, the dark looks back. I felt a small chill move across my arms. Not fear, exactly. More like awareness. That strange feeling you get when you suddenly remember you have a body, that you exist in a space. Close your eyes, the voice whispered. I don't know why I listened this time. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was how tired I was. Or maybe part of me wanted to prove that nothing would happen, that I was stronger than a bedtime horror story. I closed my eyes and kept them closed. The story shifted again. It talked about a game. A simple one. A rule whispered from one person to another, passed down like a secret. If you close your eyes and listen closely enough, you can hear what the dark is hiding. At first, it's just noise. A ringing. A distant hum. But if you don't open your eyes, if you trust the voice and stay still, something else begins to form. I heard it then. That faint sound. Not in the room, but inside my head. Like a breath that wasn't mine. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was suggestion. Imagination. The power of words painting pictures where there were none. I tried to open my eyes, but something stopped me. Not physically. Just a hesitation. A thought that said, wait. Just listen a little longer. The voice described the moment perfectly. The hesitation. The curiosity. The way fear and comfort can feel the same when you're half asleep. It described how the listener begins to feel less alone in the dark, even though they should feel more afraid. Don't open your eyes yet, the voice said. You're doing so well. That's when I realized something was wrong. The story wasn't following a script anymore. It wasn't building toward a scare or a reveal. It was reacting, responding, speaking to me, not at me. The pauses felt time to my breathing. The words landed right where my thoughts were forming. It talked about me. Not my name, not my face, but my choices, my doubt, my need to know what would happen next. I opened my eyes. The room looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The shadows seemed heavier, as if they had weight. The corners of the room felt farther away. I checked the video progress bar again. It was still playing, but the timestamp didn't move. The voice continued. It spoke calmly, explaining that some stories don't end when the video does. Some stories need participation. They need attention. They need you to close your eyes and let them finish what they started. My finger hovered over the screen, ready to exit, to close the app, to laugh this off and go to sleep. But my body felt slow, like I was moving through water. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't threaten me. It didn't have to. Close your eyes, it said one more time, softer than ever. I didn't want to. But the room felt wrong when my eyes were open. Too sharp. Too exposed. And the darkness behind my eyelids suddenly felt safer. Like a place I was meant to return to. Like somewhere that had been waiting patiently. As I lay there, caught between fear and comfort, I realized the story wasn't just a bedtime horror story anymore. It was a test. A doorway. A question with only one answer it would accept. I don't know what happens when you keep your eyes closed long enough. I don't know what listens back when the dark grows quiet. All I know is that the voice is still there, still waiting, and it hasn't finished telling its story yet. And now that you've listened this far, it knows you're here too. So when the moment comes, when the voice grows soft and familiar, and the night feels a little heavier than usual, ask yourself one thing before you decide. When the story tells you to close your eyes, will you? I didn't answer the voice. Not out loud. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the room and the softer hum beneath it, the one I couldn't tell was real or imagined. The video kept playing, but the voice went silent, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next. That silence felt heavier than any sound. It pressed against my ears, filled my chest, made every small movement feel loud and wrong. I tried to remember when I'd last felt this uneasy over something so small. A video. A story. It shouldn't have mattered. Yet my body reacted as if it did. My shoulders stayed tense. My jaw hurt from clenching. My eyes felt dry, but blinking didn't help. I was fully awake now, more awake than I've been all day. The voice returned, but it didn't jump back in where it left off. Instead, it spoke as if time had passed, as if it knew I needed space before hearing more. It talked about nights like this one. About people who stay awake longer than they should, not because they aren't tired, but because sleep feels like stepping into something unknown. It said some people fear dreams, others fear silence, and some fear what happens in the moment just before sleep, when thoughts lose their shape. That part hit close. I'd always struggled with that moment. My mind never shut off easily. I replayed conversations, imagined worst-case scenarios, remembered things I wished I'd done differently. Sleep wasn't rest. It was surrender. The story began to explain where the game came from. Not as a legend with a clear origin, but as a pattern. A habit passed quietly from one person to another. Late-night dares. Sleepover whispers. Someone always said they knew a way to fall asleep instantly. Someone always said it worked better if you didn't question it. Close your eyes, the voice said, not as a command this time, but as a memory. Something spoken long ago. It described a child lying in bed, counting breaths, trying to ignore the way the darkness felt crowded. A parent's footsteps fading down the hall. A door closing. That moment when you realize you're alone with your thoughts. The child hears the words for the first time then, spoken by an older sibling or a friend. Half joking, half serious. Close your eyes and listen. Don't peek. Don't move. I felt an uncomfortable twist in my chest. Not because the story was scary, but because it felt familiar. I remembered being young, staring into the dark, convinced something would happen if I stopped watching. As if my open eyes were the only thing keeping the night under control. The voice talked about how some children play the game once and forget it. Nothing happens. They grow up. They sleep just fine. But others feel something. A shift. A sense that the dark noticed them noticing it. Those are the ones who remember the words years later, late at night, when they're tired enough to listen again. I checked the time on my phone. Barely a few minutes had passed, but it felt longer. The room still looked normal, but my awareness of it had changed. Every shadow felt intentional. Every sound seemed placed. Even my own breathing felt too loud, like it might interrupt something delicate. The voice began to describe the person in the story more clearly now. An adult. Someone ordinary. Someone who liked listening to bedtime horror stories to relax. Someone who told themselves it was just entertainment, just background noise to drift off to sleep. Someone who believed that as long as their eyes were open, they were safe. I shifted under the blanket, a small movement that felt bigger than it was. The voice paused, then continued, unbothered. It talked about how the game doesn't start the moment you close your eyes. It starts earlier. It starts when you listen, when you imagine, when you wonder what would happen if you actually followed the rules all the way through. I realized then that I hadn't stopped wondering. The story explained that the dark behind your eyelids isn't empty. It's filled with the afterimage of the world you just left. Shapes, colors, movement. Normally, your mind ignores it, turning it into dreams or nothing at all. But if you pay attention, if you listen closely enough, you can separate the noise from something else. I felt that faint ringing again, the same one I'd noticed before. I hadn't wanted to admit it was still there. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, but now that the voice mentioned it, it felt clearer. Like a thread being pulled gently, slowly, from somewhere deep inside my head. The voice lowered, becoming more personal, more careful. It said the hardest part of the game isn't keeping your eyes closed. It's resisting the urge to check. To make sure you're still alone. To remind yourself that you're in control. That urge, it said, is what keeps most people safe. Curiosity pulls them forward, but fear pulls them back at the last second. Fear isn't the enemy, the voice said. It's the door. I didn't like that. I didn't like how calmly it was said, how reasonable it sounded. I sat up slightly, propping myself against the headboard. My heart was beating faster again, not from panic, but from a growing sense of being involved in something I hadn't agreed to. The voice talked about those who didn't open their eyes. Those who listened past the ringing, past the hum, past the moment when the dark starts to feel crowded. It didn't say what they found. It only said they learned something. Something about attention. Something about how being watched and being known aren't the same thing. I swallowed hard. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, like the walls were leaning in to hear better. I told myself I could stop at any time. I could turn off the video, turn on the light, break the spell. The thought should have comforted me. It didn't. Instead, a strange idea crept in. What if stopping was worse? What if listening halfway was the real mistake? The voice hadn't threatened me. It hadn't promised anything either. It simply continued, patient and steady, as if it knew I'd keep listening no matter what I told myself. It returned to the person in the story, describing how they began to notice changes during the day. Small things. Shadows that lingered a moment too long. The feeling of being almost recognized by strangers. Sleep that came easier, but felt heavier, deeper, like sinking instead of resting. I frowned, trying to separate the story from myself. But the line blurred more with every sentence. I had been sleeping strangely lately. Vivid dreams. Long stretches of darkness, without memory. I chalked it up to stress. Now I wasn't so sure. The voice softened again, as if sensing my discomfort. It reminded the listener that the game doesn't force anything. It only invites. It only waits. The dark, it said, is very patient. As the words settled into the quiet of my room, I realized something that made my skin prickle. The voice hadn't asked me to close my eyes again. Not yet. It was laying groundwork, building context, making sure I understood what was at stake without ever saying it out loud. I stared at the dark space just beyond my bedside lamp, feeling caught between wanting answers and wanting safety. The story was still unfolding, still pulling threads together, and I knew deep down that when the invitation came again, it would feel harder to refuse. The voice paused once more, leaving me alone with my thoughts, with the ringing, with a growing sense that this bedtime horror story wasn't finished explaining why it had chosen me. The pause stretched longer than I expected, long enough for my thoughts to wander into places I didn't like. I wondered if the silence was part of the story, or if the video had frozen again. I checked the screen. Still playing. Still counting time. Whatever was happening, it was intentional. When the voice returned, it didn't sound closer or louder. It sounded steadier, like someone settling into a conversation they'd been meaning to have for a long time. It talked about how every story needs a listener, but some listeners need the story more than they realize. It said people often search for horror stories not because they want to be scared, but because fear makes them feel present, awake, real. That felt uncomfortably accurate. The voice shifted perspective then, moving away from me, away from the person in the bed, and into memories that didn't feel like mine but felt close enough to touch. It spoke of others who had listened before. Not names or faces, just moments. A college student listening through headphones in a dark dorm room. A night shift worker playing a story in the background to stay awake. A parent lying beside a sleeping child, desperate for rest. Each of them heard the same words. Each of them reached the same moment of choice. Some ignored it. The voice explained that those people forgot the story quickly. It became just another creepy video in their watch history. They slept fine. They moved on. But others didn't forget. Others felt a pull, subtle but persistent, like a thought that keeps returning no matter how often you push it away. I shifted again, feeling a faint ache in my neck from holding still too long. The idea that this wasn't a one-time experience bothered me more than any imagined monster. It suggested commitment, continuation, a slow process instead of a sudden scare. The voice returned to the game, adding rules I didn't remember hearing before. Not strict ones, but patterns. It worked best at night. It worked best when you were alone. And it worked best when you were already tired enough to doubt your own senses. The story didn't say why. It didn't have to. I thought about how perfectly that described my situation. The thought made my stomach tighten. Then the voice did something unexpected. It introduced doubt. It acknowledged that the listener might think this was all suggestion, all psychology, a clever use of words and timing. It said that skepticism didn't ruin the game. In some ways, it made it stronger. People who questioned it tended to listen more closely, searching for flaws, missing the point entirely. I felt seen in a way I didn't like. The story began to explore what the conflict really was. Not between light and dark or sleep and waking, but between attention and avoidance. The dark, the voice said, doesn't chase you. It doesn't need to. It waits to see what you'll do when there's nothing else demanding your focus. That idea lingered with me. In a world full of noise, notifications, and constant distraction, the dark felt like the only quiet place left. And quiet can be tempting. The voice shifted again, offering another perspective. This time, it followed someone who had gone further than most. Someone who had started closing their eyes during the story, not just once, but every time the voice suggested it. They treated it like a ritual, a way to relax, a way to escape. At first, nothing bad happened. Sleep came faster. Dreams felt deeper. They woke up feeling rested, almost refreshed in a way they hadn't felt in years. That success made it harder to stop. Why quit something that seemed to help? But then small things began to change. The voice described moments when this person felt watched, not in a threatening way, but in a familiar one, as if someone knew them well enough to anticipate their movements. They began to notice patterns in shadows, in reflections, in the space behind their eyelids when they closed their eyes even during the day. I rubbed my hands together, trying to ground myself in the physical world. The fabric of the blanket, the cool air on my skin, the faint noise from outside. It helped, but only a little. The story didn't say the person was in danger. That was the unsettling part. It framed everything as neutral, observational, like a natural consequence rather than a punishment. The conflict wasn't about survival. It was about control, about who decides when the game ends. The voice returned to me again, gently weaving my presence back into the narrative, without directly calling me out. It talked about how listeners sometimes feel an urge to test themselves, to prove they can handle it, to see how long they can keep their eyes closed, how deeply they can listen. I felt that urge stirring, not strongly, not yet, but it was there, quiet and patient. The voice asked a question then, not directly, but in the way stories do. What happens if you never look away? What happens if you stop checking to make sure nothing has changed? I didn't like where my thoughts went after that. Another angle emerged, this one more unsettling than the last. The voice spoke about how the game looks different depending on who's playing. For some, it feels comforting. For others, it feels intrusive. The difference, it said, lies in what you're trying to escape. Those running from exhaustion experience rest. Those running from themselves experience something else. I thought about my own reasons for listening, for staying, for not turning it off when every logical part of me said I should. The answer wasn't flattering. The voice slowed, letting each word settle. It talked about how the main conflict isn't whether the dark will respond, but whether the listener is ready for the response. The dark doesn't speak in words. It speaks in impressions, in feelings, in moments of recognition that can't be explained away. The ringing returned, louder now, or maybe I was just paying more attention. I pressed my lips together, feeling a growing sense of anticipation mixed with dread. The story wasn't rushing. It was building, layer by layer, making sure I understood what was unfolding without ever showing its hand. It circled back to the beginning, to the simple instruction that had started everything. Close your eyes. Not as a demand, not as a threat, as an invitation that carried weight only because of what came after. The voice made it clear that the real danger wasn't closing your eyes once. It was what happened after you realized you wanted to do it again. As the words faded into another deliberate pause, I sat there, caught between curiosity and caution, knowing the story was drawing closer to a point where watching from the outside wouldn't be possible anymore. The tension didn't break. It tightened. And somewhere in the quiet, beneath my breathing and the hum of the room, I felt the unmistakable sense that whatever was listening had noticed I was still here. The pause ended slowly, like the story was taking a breath. When the voice returned, it sounded closer somehow, not louder, but more present, as if it no longer needed to explain itself, as if we had reached a point where explanation didn't matter as much as experience. It spoke about thresholds, about moments that don't feel important until you pass them and realize there's no clear way back. It said most people imagine climaxes as loud things, sudden shocks, sharp turns, something obvious. But real tension, it explained, builds quietly. It grows in the background, unnoticed, until you realize your choices have narrowed. I felt that truth settle in my chest. At some point, without deciding to, I had stopped thinking about turning the video off. The option still existed, technically, but it felt distant, like a door in a dream you know you won't reach in time. The voice described the listener in the story reaching that same point. Nights passed. The game became routine. Closing their eyes no longer felt risky. It felt necessary. The darkness behind their eyelids began to feel familiar, almost structured, like a place rather than an absence. The ringing sound transformed into something steadier, more rhythmic, like a signal. My heart started beating faster as I realized I could hear that rhythm too. It matched my pulse so closely that for a moment I couldn't tell which one came first. The voice didn't rush. It let that detail linger, knowing I would notice it on my own. It talked about how the main conflict sharpens when comfort replaces fear. When the listener stops asking whether they should continue and starts wondering what would happen if they didn't. That question scared me more than anything else so far. The room felt dimmer, even though the light hadn't changed. Shadows stretched along the walls, not moving, just existing with more confidence. I felt like I was sitting at the center of something that had been slowly arranging itself around me. The voice introduced another perspective, one I hadn't expected. It spoke about the dark itself, not as a character, not as something alive, but as a space shaped by attention. It said the dark doesn't take. It reflects. It becomes whatever the listener brings with them when they finally stop looking away. That idea made my throat feel tight. I thought about all the things I avoided during the day, the thoughts I pushed aside, the feelings I drowned out with noise and distraction. If the dark reflected those things, what would it show me? The voice seemed to sense that shift in my thinking. It slowed even further, each word deliberate, careful. It said the climax of the game isn't a moment of danger. It's a moment of recognition. The instant the listener realizes the story has stopped being about someone else. I felt that realization pressing in, undeniable now. The story had been narrowing its focus, tightening its frame, drawing everything back toward me. The background, the context, the warnings, they all pointed here. The voice returned to the listener in the story, describing the night when they finally understood they were being answered. Not spoken to, but acknowledged. They closed their eyes as they always did, but this time the darkness felt different. Responsive, as if it were waiting for permission. My hands felt cold. I flexed my fingers, grounding myself again, but the sensation passed through me without anchoring. The ringing grew clearer, no longer just a sound but a presence, something with shape and intention. The voice asked another quiet question, wrapped in narrative instead of command. What do you do when the thing you feared turns out to be the thing that's been listening all along? I swallowed hard. The tension in the room felt almost physical now, like pressure building before a storm. Every instinct told me something was about to happen, not suddenly, but inevitably. The voice described the final stretch before the climax. The listener lying perfectly still, breathing shallow, eyes closed for longer than ever before. Not because they were forced, but because opening them felt like breaking a fragile connection. I realized I was mirroring that stillness without meaning to. My body had gone quiet. Even my breathing felt cautious, like I didn't want to interrupt. The story emphasized choice again. It said the game always offers one last moment of clarity, a brief window where the listener can decide whether to stay or step back. That moment feels calm, almost peaceful, which is why it's so dangerous. Calm makes people brave in the wrong direction. The voice lowered, becoming nearly a whisper. It said this was that moment. My pulse thudded in my ears. I stared at the space just beyond the light, feeling the weight of everything that had led here. The background, the rules, the warnings disguised as observations. All of it pointed toward a single action I hadn't taken yet. The voice didn't say the words. Not this time. It didn't need to. The silence itself carried the instruction. I felt the urge rise, stronger than before, no longer curiosity, but anticipation. As if something was waiting on the other side of my eyelids, patient and certain I would eventually understand. The story drew closer to its edge. The tension stretched thin enough to hum. Whatever came next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be obvious. It would be personal. And as the voice fell silent once more, leaving the choice hanging in the air, I knew the climax wasn't about what the dark would do. It was about what I was willing to let it see. The silence stretched, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt full, like a held breath that didn't belong to me. I stayed still, aware of every inch of my body, aware of how the air felt heavier against my skin. The choice was still there hovering, but something had changed. It no longer felt like I was deciding whether to close my eyes. It felt like something else was deciding how long it would wait. The voice returned softly, almost casually, as if nothing important had just happened. It said that most people think the game is between them and the dark. That's the first misunderstanding. The second, it explained, is believing they are the only one playing. That sentence landed harder than anything before it. The story shifted again, but this time it didn't drift away into abstract ideas or unnamed listeners. It narrowed its focus to moments happening right now, parallel moments, unfolding in different rooms, different places. Other people listening to the same bedtime horror story. Other people lying awake in the dark, feeling that same pull, hearing that same ringing, thinking they were alone in the experience. I felt a chill move through me, slow and deep. The idea that this wasn't private, that it wasn't contained to my room, made everything feel less controlled, less safe. The voice described how the game changed when more than one person listened closely at the same time. Not because they interacted with each other, but because attention, when shared, shaped the dark differently. It created overlap, echoes, patterns that didn't belong to any single mind. I thought about how many people might be listening right now. Headphones in, lights off, trusting the calm tone of a bedtime story. The thought made my chest tighten. The voice went on, explaining that some listeners begin to notice things that can't be explained by their own choices alone. Dreams that feel borrowed. Familiar images that don't belong to their memories. A sense of recognition when they hear certain words, as if someone else reacted first and left an imprint behind. That was the second twist, though it wasn't presented as one. It was delivered gently, like a truth that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. The game wasn't just between you and the dark. It was between you and everyone else who had ever listened long enough. I felt a sudden, uncomfortable awareness of my own thoughts. Which ones were mine? Which ones had been nudged into place by the story? The line between influence and choice blurred further. The voice returned to the listener in the story, describing how they began to feel less alone at night, even when no one else was there. Not comforted, accompanied, as if the dark carried traces of other attention, other curiosity, lingering like fingerprints. The ringing shifted again, no longer steady, but layered. I noticed it then, more than one rhythm, faint but distinct, overlapping just enough to feel wrong. My breathing faltered. I focused on slowing it down, but the sound didn't follow anymore. The voice didn't acknowledge the sound. It didn't need to. It moved deeper into the conflict, explaining that the real risk wasn't being seen by the dark. It was becoming visible to everything else that had learned how to look. That idea settled into me slowly, like a realization I didn't want but couldn't reject. The story had never promised danger. It had promised connection. And connection, I was starting to understand, could be far more unsettling. The voice posed another quiet question, again without directly asking it. What happens when you realize your private experience isn't private at all? When the dark behind your eyes becomes a shared space instead of a refuge? I shifted, finally breaking my stillness, but the movement didn't relieve the pressure. If anything, it made me more aware of how tightly the tension had wrapped itself around me. The story described the listener reaching this understanding late one night, lying awake, eyes closed, feeling that familiar comfort turn uncertain. The dark responded differently then. Less reflective, more responsive, as if it had learned what to show based on what others had already brought with them. Images flickered behind my eyelids without me closing them. Not clear pictures, just impressions. Motion, depth, a sense of distance that didn't belong to the room I was in. I blinked hard, trying to clear it away. The voice softened, almost reassuring. It said this was the point where most people panic, where they try to quit, to break the pattern, to reclaim control by forcing their eyes open and flooding the room with light. Sometimes that works. Sometimes. That single word hung in the air, heavy with implication. The voice explained that the game adapts, that once attention has been shared, once patterns have formed, stopping doesn't always mean ending. For some listeners, the dark lingers, not as fear, but as awareness, a sense of being slightly out of sync with the world, like they're always a half second behind or ahead of something they can't see. I felt my jaw tighten. The stakes had shifted again. This wasn't just about whether I closed my eyes tonight. It was about what might follow me into tomorrow, into waking hours, into moments when I wasn't prepared to listen. The voice circled back to the present, grounding the story in the now. It reminded the listener that this moment, the one just before the climax, is when the rules feel most flexible. When it seems like there's still time to decide how deep to go. The ringing swelled briefly, then settled. I noticed that my fear had changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy, thoughtful, tangled with something dangerously close to curiosity. The voice lowered again, intimate but calm. It said the second twist of the game isn't realizing you're not alone. It's realizing you were never meant to be. That idea struck deep, touching something I hadn't named before. Loneliness. The quiet kind. The kind that makes bedtime stories feel comforting and night feel endless. The tension thickened, pulling everything tighter. The voice slowed, guiding the listener closer to the edge without pushing. It made it clear that whatever came next would change how the game felt forever. As the words faded into another deliberate pause, I understood that the climax wasn't approaching because something was about to appear. It was approaching because I was about to understand exactly what I had been sharing my attention with, and whether it was willing to let me take it back. The pause ended in a way I didn't expect, not with a sound, but with a feeling like a decision had already been made, whether I agreed to it or not. The voice returned one last time, steady and calm, and for the first time it stopped circling the truth. It said the climax of the game wasn't closing your eyes. It was realizing when you no longer needed to be told. I felt it then, clear and undeniable. The urge wasn't coming from the story anymore. It was coming from me, from a place deeper than curiosity, deeper than fear. A quiet acceptance had settled in, the kind that comes when resistance finally runs out. I let my eyes close. The darkness behind my eyelids wasn't empty. It wasn't chaotic either. It felt organized, layered, like a space that had been used before. The ringing sound smoothed out, blending into something wider, like distant movement or slow breathing that didn't belong to any single source. The voice continued, but now it sounded different. Not closer, not farther. Just unnecessary. The words felt like they were arriving at the same time as my understanding, not leading it. It explained the truth at last. The game was never about the dark itself. It was about attention, about where people placed it when everything else went quiet. The dark didn't create anything new. It gathered what people left behind when they stopped looking, thoughts, fears, unfinished feelings, moments of honesty they didn't share during the day. That was the shared space. I understood then why it felt familiar, why it felt patient. This wasn't something waiting to take me. It was something built slowly, night after night, by people like me. Listeners. Insomniacs. Those who stayed awake long enough to listen instead of distract themselves. The main conflict unraveled in that moment. I hadn't been chosen. I had volunteered. Every time I kept listening. Every time I didn't turn it off. Every time I wondered what would happen next instead of asking why I needed to know. The darkness responded, not with an image, not with a voice, but with recognition. A sense of being fully seen without judgment. It was unsettling, yes, but also strangely grounding. There was no threat in it. No demand. Just presence. The voice said the game ends when the listener understands this. When they realize nothing is forcing them to stay. The dark doesn't trap. It invites. And invitations only work if you keep accepting them. I felt the pressure ease slightly, like a knot loosening. My breathing deepened. For the first time since the story began, I felt calm, not numb, not detached, but clear. I opened my eyes. The room snapped back into focus. Same walls. Same shadows. Same quiet hum. The video had ended. The screen was dark, reflecting my own face faintly back at me. My heart still beat fast, but it was steady. I laughed softly under my breath, the sound breaking the tension completely. It was over. The story had reached its climax, explained its mystery, resolved its conflict. There was no monster, no curse, just a psychological horror story about attention and choice. I stood up, turned on the light, and the room felt normal again. That's when my phone buzzed. A notification. A new video suggestion. Same channel. Same simple design. Part 2 is better with your eyes closed. I stared at it longer than I should have. That's when the final twist settled in, slow and cold. The story had ended for me. But the game hadn't. Because now I understood something the voice never said out loud. Understanding didn't remove the dark. It only changed my relationship with it. The shared space didn't disappear just because I stepped away. It remained, shaped by everyone else who kept listening. And now that I knew how it worked, now that I knew what closing my eyes really meant, the choice felt heavier than before. I locked my phone and set it face down on the table. I told myself I wouldn't watch it. That knowing was enough. That awareness was protection. As I lay back down, the room quiet again, I closed my eyes naturally, without thinking. Just asleep. The darkness welcomed me the same way it always had. Patient, familiar, and listening. Sleep didn't come the way I expected it to. At first, I lay there tense, waiting for something dramatic to happen. Waiting for the darkness to change, to respond, to prove that the story had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. But nothing did. The room stayed quiet. My breathing slowed. The familiar weight of tiredness finally settled into my body. Not sharp anymore, just heavy and real. When I slept, I didn't dream of shadows or voices. I dreamed of ordinary things. Hallways. Faces I half recognized. Conversations that felt important but slipped away when I tried to remember them. When I woke up, sunlight was pushing through the curtains, soft and harmless. Morning had come like it always did. For a moment, I wondered if the entire experience had been exaggerated by the night. That strange clarity that sometimes hits at 2 a.m. and fades by breakfast. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and looked around my room. Everything was normal. No lingering sounds. No strange feelings in the corners of my vision. But something had changed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't dread. It was awareness. Over the next few days, I noticed it in small ways. I paid more attention to silence. Not in a nervous way, but in a thoughtful one. I realized how rarely we let ourselves sit without noise, without distraction. Music, videos, endless scrolling. We fill every quiet moment, then wonder why the dark feels uncomfortable when it finally arrives. The story hadn't given me something to be afraid of. It had taken something away. Ignorance. I didn't watch the second video. Not that day. Not the next. The notification stayed there for a while, then disappeared beneath newer ones. Life went on. Work. Conversations. Sleep. And yet, sometimes at night, just before drifting off, I remembered the calm of that shared space. The way it hadn't judged or demanded. The way it simply existed because people kept giving it attention. That realization answered one of the biggest questions the story left behind. The dark wasn't an enemy. It was a mirror. It reflected whatever we brought into it. Fear, exhaustion, loneliness, curiosity. The danger wasn't in closing your eyes. It was in never examining why you wanted to. I started sleeping better, strangely enough. Not because of the game, but because I stopped fighting the quiet. I let my thoughts pass instead of chasing them. I let the day end when it ended. The ringing never came back. Or maybe I just stopped listening for it. Sometimes, though, I'd catch myself pausing before sleep, hovering on that edge again. Not tempted, just aware. And I'd think about the others the story mentioned. The countless listeners out there finding comfort or curiosity in a chilling bedtime horror story, each one shaping that shared darkness in their own way. That subplot resolved itself quietly. Not everyone who listens is pulled in. Not everyone who closes their eyes stays. Some people just hear a story and move on. And that's okay. The game doesn't need everyone. It never did. Weeks passed. Then months. One night, long after the story had faded from my daily thoughts, I found myself awake again, staring at the ceiling. Not restless, just thinking. The house was quiet in that deep, late-night way where even familiar sounds feel distant. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel pulled. I just felt present. I closed my eyes. Nothing happened. And that was the point. The final takeaway came to me then, clear and simple. The power of the story wasn't in the words or the voice or the darkness. It was in choice, in awareness, in realizing that attention is something we give, not something that's taken from us. The dark will always be there when the lights go out. Silence will always follow noise. But what we project into those spaces is up to us. Fear grows when we feed it without understanding. Calm grows when we let ourselves sit with it honestly. The story ended because it had nothing left to teach me. I still enjoy bedtime horror stories. I still listen late at night sometimes, letting the atmosphere wash over me. But I listen differently now. I don't surrender control. I don't chase the edge just to prove I can stand there. And when a voice tells me to close my eyes, I smile a little to myself. Because now I know the difference between being invited and being led. The darkness doesn't need to be feared. It only needs to be understood. And once you understand it, it stops whispering your name. It just lets you sleep.